I mentioned Dr. Adam Smith's book on the wealth of nations, which was just published, and that Sir John Pringle had observed to me that Dr. Smith, who had never been in trade, could not be expected to write well on that subject any more than a lawyer upon physics or medicine. Johnson said, "He is mistaken, sir. A man who has never been engaged in trade himself may undoubtedly write well upon trade, and there is nothing which requires more to be illustrated by philosophy than trade does. As to mere wealth, that is to say, money, it is clear that one nation or one individual cannot increase its store but by making another poorer. But trade procures what is more valuable, the reciprocation of the peculiar advantages of different countries. A merchant seldom thinks but of his own particular trade. To write a good book upon it, a man must have extensive views. It is not necessary to have practice to write well upon a subject." I mentioned law as a subject on which no man could write well without practice. Johnson said, "Why, sir, in England there is so much money is to be got by the practice of the law. Most of our writers upon it have been in practice, though Blackstone has not been much in practice when he published his commentaries. But upon the continent, the great writer in law have not all been in practice. Grotius indeed was, but Pufendorf was not. Burlamaqui was not." When we had talked of the great consequence which a man acquired by being employed of his profession, I suggested a doubt of the justice of the general opinion that it is improper in a lawyer to solicit employment. For why, I urged, should it not be equally allowable to solicit that as the means of consequence as it is to solicit votes to the elected member of Parliament? Mr. Stram had told me that a countryman of his and mine, footnote here tells us is Wedderburn, who had risen to eminence on the law, had, when first making his way, solicited him to get him employed in city causes. Johnson said, "Sir, it is wrong to stir up lawsuits, but when once it is certain that a lawsuit is to go on, there is nothing wrong in a lawyer's endeavoring that he shall have the benefit rather than another." I said, "You would not solicit employment, sir, if you were a lawyer." Johnson said, "No, sir, but not because I should think it wrong, but because I should disdain it." This was a good distinction, which will be felt by men of just pride. He proceeded, "However, I would not have a lawyer to be wanting to himself in using fair means. I would have him to inject a little hint now and then to prevent his being overlooked." These pages are sticking together. Lord Montestrat's bill for a Scotch militia, in supporting which his lordship had made an able speech in the House of Commons, was now a pretty general topic of conversation. Johnson said of this, "As Scotland contributes so little land tax towards the general support of the nation, it ought not to have a militia paid out of the general fund unless it should be thought for the general interest that Scotland should be protected from an invasion which no man can think it will happen. For what enemy would invade Scotland where there is nothing to be got? No, sir, now that the Scotch have not the pay of English soldiers spent among them, as so many troops are sent abroad, they are trying to get money another way, by having a militia paid. If they are afraid and seriously desire to have an armed force to defend them, they should pay for it. Your scheme is to retain a part of your little land tax by making us pay and clothe your militia." Boswell, I said, "You should not talk of we and you, sir. There is now an union." Johnson answered, "There must be a distinction of interests, while the proportions of land tax are so unequal. If Yorkshire should say, instead of paying our land tax, we will keep a great number of militia, it would be unreasonable. In this argument, my friend was certainly in the wrong. The land tax is unequally proportioned between different parts of England, as between England and Scotland. Nay, it is considerably unequal in Scotland itself. But the land tax is but a small part of the numerous branches of public revenue, all of which Scotland pays precisely as English does. A French invasion made in Scotland would soon penetrate into England. Johnson thus discoursed upon supposed obligations in settling estates. Quote, where a man gets the unlimited property of an estate, there is no obligation upon him in justice to leave it to one person rather than to another. There is a motive of preference from kindness, and this kindness is generally entertained for the nearest relation. If I owe a particular man a sum of money, I am obliged to let that man have it the next money I get, and cannot in justice let another man have it. But if I owe money to no man, I may dispose of what I get as I please. There is not a debitum justitiae, a debt in law, to a man's next heir. By the way, I just made up that pronunciation. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Debitum justitate, to a man's next heir. There is only a debitum caritatis, a debt of kindness. It is plain, then, that I have morally a choice according to my liking. If I have a brother in want, he has a claim for my affection to my assistance. But if I have also a brother in want, whom I like better, he has a preferable claim. The right of an heir at law is only this, that he is to have the succession to an estate in case no other person is appointed to it by the owner. His right is merely preferable to that of the king. We got into a boat to cross over to Blackfriars, and as we moved along the Thames, I talked to him of a little volume, which, altogether unknown to him, was advertised to be published in a few days under the title of Johnsonia, or Bon Mots of Dr. Johnson. Johnson replied, Sir, it is a mighty impudent thing. I said, Pray, sir, could you have no redress if you were to prosecute a publisher for bringing out under your name what you never said, and ascribing to you dull, stupid nonsense, or making you swear profanely, as many ignorant relators of your bon mots do? Johnson answered, No, sir, there will always be some truth mixed with the falsehood, and how can it be ascertained how much is true and how much is false? Besides, sir, what damages would a jury give me for having been represented as swearing? I said, I think, sir, you should at least disavow such a publication, because the world and posterity might with much plausible foundation say, Here is a volume which was publicly advertised and came out in Dr. Johnson's own time, and by his silence was admitted to him to be genuine. Johnson answered, I shall give myself no trouble about the matter. He was perhaps above suffering from such spurious publications, but I could not help thinking that many men would be much injured in their reputation by having absurd and vicious sayings imputed to them, and that redress ought to, in such cases, to be given. I guess Johnson believes any publicity is good publicity. Johnson said, The value of every story depends on it being true. So I guess not. A story is a picture either of an individual or of human nature in general. If it be false, it is a picture of nothing. For instance, suppose a man should tell that Johnson, before setting out for Italy, as he has to cross the Alps, sat down to make himself wings. This many people would believe, but it would be a picture of nothing. Footnote here says Langston. There's a blank here. Langston, naming a worthy friend of ours, used to think a story, till I showed him that truth was essential to it. I observed to Johnson that Foote entertained us with stories which were not true, but that indeed it was properly not as narratives that Foote's stories pleased us, but as collections of ludicrous images. Johnson said, Foote is quite impartial, for he tells lies of everybody. The importance of strict and scrupulous veracity cannot be too often incalculated. Johnson was known to be so rigidly attentive to it that even in his common conversation the slightest circumstance was mentioned with exact precision. The knowledge of his having such a principle and habit made his friends have a perfect reliance on the truth of everything that he told, however it might have been doubted and told by many others. As an instance of this, I may mention an odd incident which he related as having happened to him one night at Fleet Street. A gentlewoman, said he, begged I would give her my arm to assist her in crossing the street, which I accordingly did, upon which she offered me a shilling, supposing me to be the watchman. I perceived that she was somewhat in liquor. This, if told by most people, would have been thought an invention. When told by Johnson, it was believed by his friends as much as if they had seen what passed. We landed at the temple stairs where we parted. I found him in the evening in Mrs. Williams's room. We talked of religious orders. He said, It is an unreasonable for a man to go into a Carthusian convent for fear of being immoral, as for a man to cut off his hands for fear he should steal. There is indeed great resolution in the immediate act of dismembering himself. But when that is once done, he has no longer any merit. For though it is out of his power to steal, yet he may all his life be a thief in his heart. So when a man has once become a Carthusian, he is obliged to continue so, whether he chooses it or not. Their silence, too, is absurd. We read in the Gospel of the Apostles being sent to preach, but not to hold their tongues. All severity that does not tend to increase a good or prevent an evil is idle. I said to the lady abbess, this is Mrs. Fermor, of a convent, Madame, you are here not for the love of virtue, but the fear of vice. She said, she should remember this as long as she lived. I thought it hard to give her this view of her situation when she could not help it, and indeed I wondered at the whole of what he now said, because, both in his Rambler and his Idler, he treats religious austerity with much solemnity of respect. Finding Johnson still persevering in his abstinence from wine, I ventured to speak to him of it. Johnson said, Sir, I have no objection to a man's drinking wine if he can do it in moderation. I found myself apt to go to excess in it, and therefore, after having been for some time without it, on account of illness, I thought it better not to return to it. Every man is to judge for himself according to the effects which he experiences. One of the fathers tells us he found fasting made him so peevish that he did not practice it. Though he often enlarged upon the evil of intoxication, he was by no means harsh and unforgiving to those who indulge in occasional excess of wine. One of his friends, footnote here tells us this is actually Boswell, I well remember, came to sup at a tavern with him and some other gentleman, and too plainly discovered that he had drunk too much at dinner. When one who loved mischief, this is Coleman, a footnote tells us, thinking to produce a severe censure, asked Johnson a few days afterwards, Well, sir, what did your friend say to you as an apology for being in such a situation? Johnson answered, Sir, he said all that a man should say. He said he was sorry for it. So Boswell shows up drunk occasionally, I guess. I heard him once give a very judicious practical advice upon this subject. Quoting Johnson, A man who has been drinking wine at all freely should never go into a new company. With those who have partaken of wine with him, he may be pretty well in unison, but he will probably be offensive or appear ridiculous to other people. That's true. He allowed very great influence to education. Quoting him, I do not deny, sir, but there is some original difference in minds. But it is nothing in comparison of what is formed by education. We may instance the science of numbers, which all minds are equally capable of attaining, yet we find a prodigious difference in the powers of different men in their respect after they have grown up, because their minds have been more or less exercised in it. And I think the same cause will explain the difference of excellence in other things, gradations admitting always some difference in the first principles. This is a difficult subject, but it is best to hope that diligence may do a great deal. We are sure of what it can do in increasing our mechanical force and dexterity. I again visited him on Monday. He took occasion to enlarge, as he often did, upon the wretchedness of sea life. Quoting him, A ship is worse than a gall. There is in a gall better air, better company, better conveniency of every kind, and a ship has the additional disadvantage of being in danger. When men come to like a sea life, they are not fit to live on land. Then, said I, it would be cruel in a father to breed his sons to the sea. Johnson said, It would be cruel in a father who thinks as I do. Men go to sea before they know the unhappiness of that way of life. And when they have come to know it, they cannot escape from it, because it is to them then too late to choose another profession, as indeed is generally the case with men when they have once engaged in any particular way of life. On Tuesday, March 19th, which was fixed for our proposed jaunt, we met at the morning at the Somerset Coffee House in the Strand, where we were taken up by the Oxford coach. He was accompanied by Mr. Gwynn, the architect, and a gentleman of Menton College, a young gentleman of Gloucestershire, it says here, on a footnote, whom we did not know, had the fourth seat. We soon got into conversation, for it was very remarkable of Johnson that the presence of a stranger was no restraint upon his talk. I observed that Garrick, who was about to quit the stage, would soon have an easier life. Johnson said, I doubt that, sir. I said, Why, sir, he will be Atlas, with the burthen off his back. Johnson said, But I know not, sir, if he will be so steady without his load. However, he should never play any more, but be entirely the gentleman, and not partly the player. He should no longer subject himself to be hissed by a mob, or to be insolently treated by performers, whom he used to rule with a high hand, and who would gladly retaliate. I said, I think he should play once a year for the benefits of decayed actors, as it has been said he means to do. Johnson said, Alas, sir, he will soon be a decayed actor himself. Johnson expressed his disapprobation of ornamental architecture, such as magnificent columns supporting a portico, or expensive pilasters supporting merely their own capitals, quoting him, because it consumes labor disproportionate to its utility. For the same reason he satirized statuary. Painting, said he, consumes labor not disproportionate to its effect, but a fellow will hack half a year at a block of marble to make something in stone that hardly resembles a man. The value of statuary is owing to its difficulty. You would not value the finest head cut upon a carrot. Here he seemed to me to be strangely deficient in taste, for surely statuary is a noble art of imagination, of imitation, and preserves a wonderful expression of the varieties of the human frame. And although it must be allowed that the circumstances of difficulty enhance the value of a marble head, we should consider that if it requires a long time in the performance, it has a proportionate value and durability. All right, that's enough for today. We'll leave him on the road to Oxford. Till next time, bye from Boswell.